Imagine going about your day at a mall when all of a sudden you are accused of something you didn't commit. That's precisely what would happen. When security guards harassed Mrs. Ruby, an elderly lady, they had no idea that her son was about to arrive. What occurred next left everyone in disbelief. Before we start, watch to see how this dramatic incident plays out. It was a quiet day in the mall. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We appreciate hearing from people worldwide. An older, kind black lady named Mrs. Ruby Jenkins was out shopping for her regular groceries in the afternoon. Even though her body wasn't moving as quickly as it once did, the 70-year-old lady with soft gray hair and a calm, serene demeanor always held herself with dignity as she moved down the aisles, her lovely smile lighting up her face. Mrs. Ruby's cane clicked regularly on the tiled floor. Her shopping trip was almost over, and her bags were full of basic items like bread, milk, vegetables, and her favorite tea. Despite her advanced age, she made an effort to be as independent as possible, preferring to run her errands alone. As she got closer to the exit, her pace slowed and she took a deep breath, savoring the moment of peace before leaving for home. Suddenly, two security officers in dark uniforms with stern faces blocked her path. They were big men who towered over her, their faces appearing suspicious and cold. When Mrs. Ruby awoke and looked up at them with wide eyes, one of the cops said, "Ma'am, we need to talk to you." He crossed his arms and stood in front of her, making it obvious that they wouldn't allow her pass. Mrs. Ruby blinked in confusion, asking quietly, "Is something wrong?" Her heart was starting to race a bit. "We've received reports that you were shoplifting," the second officer interjected angrily. Mrs. Ruby's grin vanished as he spoke in a harsh tone, almost as if he had already determined she was guilty. The allegation hurt and made her pulse beat even faster, and she gripped the handle of her cane harder. "No, sir," she answered, her voice quivering a bit. "I paid for everything I owned," and she reached into her bag to retrieve her receipt, her hands shaking nervously. She found it and held it up, but the officers ignored her attempt to prove she had done nothing wrong. "We need you to come with us," the first officer said firmly. Mrs. Ruby's stomach turned to knots and her mind was racing with questions like, why wouldn't they just check her receipt and let her go? She had always been extremely careful and had always done everything correctly, so why was she being treated this way? "But I didn't steal anything," she repeated. She felt her voice trembling more now. She felt panic rising in her chest, but they weren't paying attention. Suddenly, one of the officers reached out and grabbed her arm. "She almost dropped her cane," he said, and was pulled toward the back of the store. Mrs. Ruby couldn't believe this was happening, so she tried to free her arm, but the officer's grip was too strong. She begged, "I haven't done anything wrong," but the officers didn't care. They pulled her harder and the pain shot through her old, exhausted body. She looked around the mall in the hopes that someone would come to her aid. People were watching, but no one moved. Instead, they just stood there whispering to each other and giving her critical looks. She had never been in trouble before, never even raised her voice to anyone, and now here she was being dragged through the mall like a criminal. It was terrifying and humiliating, and Mrs. Ruby felt completely alone. Her breathing became shallow, and her vision became blurry as the tears started to spill over her hanging purse. Her phone fell out of her arm during the struggle and hit the floor with a gentle thud. The officer continued to drag her toward the back room without noticing, but Mrs. Ruby saw that her heart had skipped a beat. Her son Oliver, a strong and courageous boy, had advised her to call him if she ever needed assistance, and she needed him now more than ever. With unsteady hands, she reached down and picked up the phone. She struggled to unlock it with shaky fingers as the cops pulled her, but she was able to hit the call button and dial her son's number. The phone rang once, then twice, and then it clicked. "Mom." Oliver's rich voice could be heard over the phone. Mrs. Ruby muttered into the phone, her voice trembling. She is now crying uncontrollably. He arrived at the mall in a matter of minutes, his pulse quickening as he parked quickly. He marched inside, looking around until he spotted his mom being pushed around by two security officers near the back of a store. The sight hit him like a punch to the gut. His mother appeared small and fragile between the two burly men. "Oliver, please come. They're hurting me." I don't know what to do. Her face was marred by tears, and they were holding her by the arms and dragging her as if she were a criminal to a back room. A fire sparked in his chest as his emotions roared with a combination of anger and grief over the way his beloved mother, who had never damaged a person, was being handled. But he knew he had to remain composed. Oliver took a deep breath, steadied himself, and forced himself to control his emotions. He was accustomed to high-pressure situations, and this one was no exception. But as he approached them, his eyes never left the officers. His steps were firm, his fists clenched by his sides, and he could feel his blood boiling, but his face stayed stone. His voice was low and controlled, but it took all he could to maintain it that way. His mother's safety was the only thing that mattered now. Mrs. Ruby, who was obviously disturbed, glanced up at her son's voice, her eyes widening with tears as she muttered, "Oliver," her voice quivering. "This is none of your business, sir," one of the security officers said curtly, glaring at Oliver, who was obviously thinking that Oliver was just another irate bystander. Captain Johnson approached the officers, his chest rising and falling with each breath. His presence alone seemed to attract the attention of the crowd that had gathered nearby. But the officers didn't seem to notice or care. Oliver's dark eyes narrowed as he clenched his jaw, trying to control the anger that was simmering just beneath the surface. His voice was steady but commanding. "It's my business, that's my mother." The officer blinked briefly, taken aback by the sheer authority in Oliver's voice, but instead of backing down, he tightened his grip on Mrs. Ruby's arm, almost as if to prove a point. Oliver wanted to knock the man's hand off his mother, but he remained composed, saying he had to handle this right. The other officer sned, "It doesn't matter. She's suspected of stealing, and we're taking her to the back to deal with it now, unless you want to get involved in this mess." Oliver felt his chest and the burning. The officers exchanged glances and became increasingly defensive as the first one stepped toward Oliver, puffing up his chest. He obviously had no idea who he was dealing with, "You need to back off now, sir, or we'll have to call the police." Roar got even louder, but he remained calm and said, "She's done nothing wrong. You can check the receipt in her bag, but before you do anything else, you need to let go of her." Oliver almost grinned at the ridiculousness of the circumstance. "Call the police," he said. "Go ahead." The officer hesitated, unsure of how to react to Oliver's composed confidence, but instead of giving up, he tried to intimidate Oliver into leaving. "I don't think you understand how serious this is. If you interfere, we'll have you arrested, too," he said, drawing his badge from his jacket and holding it up for the officers to see. "I am Captain." Oliver's eyes darkened. Oliver Johnson of the 15th Precinct remarked in a menacing voice. One of the officers sputtered, releasing Mrs. Rue's arm. "We didn't know, sir. We were just following orders." "Kong, you will let go of my mother." Both officers froze, their eyes wide in shock as if the floor had just fallen out from under them. They stammered, stumbling over their words, their faces turning pale as they processed what had just happened. This wasn't just any random man. This was a police captain, a man who outranked every single person they could call captain. Oliver moved closer, towering over the cops. His mother was safe again, but the rage he had harbored at bay was still burning under the surface. He looked the guys in the eyes, his glare so intense that it might have sliced through stone. "You didn't know." The cops were silent, and one of them attempted to stammer an explanation, but Oliver cut him off with a stern glare. Oliver repeated his words softly but dangerously. "You didn't think to ask, did you? You didn't think to check the receipt, to listen to her, or to treat her with respect?" Oliver remarked in an emotional voice, "What if this were your mother? Would you still be so ready to touch her if she were the one being treated like a criminal and humiliated in front of strangers?" The officers' cheeks were flushed and their eyes were wide. Fearful and regretful, they felt they had made a mistake and had no solution. Oliver turned to face his mother, his face softening as he clasped her hand gently. "How are you, Mom?" Mrs. Ruby nodded slowly, still trembling. "I'm fine now, Oliver," she said in a tremulous murmur. Oliver gave her a comforting grip on the hand, before turning back to the policeman. You'll be hearing from Internal Affairs about this, he remarked icily. Without saying anything more, the cops retreated, their heads down in embarrassment. Oliver put his arm around his mother's shoulders and escorted her out of the shop, his heart still thumping in his chest, but the only thing that mattered was that she was safe. Mrs. Ruby gripped Oliver's arm, her body still shaking from the humiliation and fear. She looked up at him, her eyes full of tears, her voice barely a whisper. "Thank you, son." The weight of the moment hit Oliver hard, his heart aching for his mother, who had always been so strong and proud, and to see her treated this way filled him with deep sorrow. As Oliver and Mrs. Ruby left the mall, the weight of the ordeal hung in the air, but so did a sense of satisfaction. The officers would be held accountable for their actions, justice would be served, and even though Mrs. Ruby's heart still ached from the pain she had experienced, she knew one thing for sure. Her brave and devoted son, had put things right. You won't want to miss our next story if you're liking this one and would want to hear more captivating tales like this. So don't forget to press the subscribe button and enable alerts. Become a member of our community and check back for more fantastic stuff.